All right, peeps. Well, on today's episode of the Kung Fu Genius, I don't have Dre, and I will be talking to Professor Peter Lorge on all sorts of things about Chinese martial arts history, Shaolin myths, and well, have a listen. Let's get to it.
And every day, I practice martial arts. Watch out!
All right, everyone. Well, I'm super excited about today's episode of the Kung Fu Genius as I get to do what I love to do, which is sit and listen and learn something for a change, which I don't get to do much when I have Dre sitting across from me. Today, I'm talking to Professor Peter Lorge. He is a historian and a professor of Chinese history in particular. He wrote this fantastic book, Chinese Martial Arts, and it is the best book on Chinese martial arts history. I've discussed it multiple times in the podcast, and in fact, it was one of our great listeners who recommended this book to me in the comments. Don't remember who you are, but shout out to you. It's absolutely fascinating. My discussion today with Peter Lorge is really fascinating. Before we get started, I want to read his extensive, awesome resume, because when I say, the Shaolin myths might be BS, everyone's like, KFG, you can't say that. We love Shaolin myths and BS. But when I get a professor who's actually studied it and written a book about it, maybe you guys will think the KFG is not quite so crazy. So anyway, just so you know why it's kind of a big deal, we have him on today. I'm going to read his very extensive resume, which I got off of his website, so just have a listen. Professor Peter Lorge is an associate professor of history and an associate professor of Asian studies. He is a historian of 10th and 11th century China, with particular interest in Chinese military, political, and social history. Professor Lorge graduated with a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1996. Well, it was the year I graduated high school. He is the author of The Reunification of China, Peace Through War Under the Song Dynasty, published back in 2015. This book here, Chinese Martial Arts from Antiquity to the 21st Century, which came out in 2012. The Asian Military Revolution, From Gunpowder to the Bomb, back in 2008. War, Politics, and Society in Early Modern China, back in 2005. And he is the co-editor of Chinese and Indian Warfare from the Classical Age to 1870, back in 2014, and the editor of the publications Debating War in Chinese History, in 2013, 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms, back in 2011, The Warfare in China to 1600, back in 2005, and his book series with Routledge, Asian States and Empires, has published 13 books. Professor Lorge is one of the founders and executive board members of the Chinese Military History Society. He won the Harriet S. Gilliam Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2004 and has appeared on CNN to discuss Chinese military affairs. In 2007, he attended the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies workshop on teaching national security at Basin Harbor. Additionally, in his specializations are Chinese martial arts and Chinese film, which you hear a little bit about in today's interview. So anyway, kind of a big deal. He is probably one of the most qualified of all the people we've had here in terms of academics, although Matthew Pauly is no slouch in the academic sector as well. So just before we get started here, just a reminder that the best way to support the Kung Fu Genius is on Patreon. Patreon.com/The Kung Fu Genius. For as little as $5 a month, you can get access to episodes early and all sorts of Instagram subscriber reels. So if you want to get my cool subscriber reels where I teach Wing Chun in little 90-second increments, because that's how long you got on reels on Instagram, you can subscribe to me on Instagram. But if you're a Patreon supporter, you get them included. I just dumped a series of like 10 or so videos, my take on the Sifu Learning Ting's book Dynamic Wing Chun, where I go through all the lessons, and I'm doing my take on it. So lots of goodies there. Higher tiers of support get all sorts of things. And if you don't want to support us on Patreon, you can support us here on YouTube with memberships. We have a couple different tiers for that. You can check out the link below. So without any further ado, my interview with Professor Peter Lorge. Are you a Wing Chun instructor that needs some extra guidance in your own training? My private online Wing Chun training offers a multitude of benefits for instructors. Here are some of those benefits. 1, access to expert guidance, namely Me, with my experience teaching instructors from all over the world, I can create a program just for you, whether it's the details of the advanced Wing Chun, something more fundamental, or just to help you create a program for your own students. 2, flexible learning. The training can be worked around your schedule and what's most convenient for you. I don't charge extra if you bring a training partner to do the lesson with you, so bring that partner and you can get more benefit, and I can teach the two of you how to train together. 3, comprehensive curriculum. Whether you want to teach in a more traditional way or you want to upgrade your material to a more modern style, I can help you create the perfect program for your students and for yourself. And 4, personalized coaching. This program will be exactly what you're interested in without any fluff or blah, blah, blah to run things out. We get right to it, and I want you to be happy with the improvements to your training and to the curriculum. Don't miss out on these incredible benefits. Enroll in online Wing Chun private training with me and take your Wing Chun skills to the next level. Use the code KFG online to get a 15% discount on monthly subscriptions for either 2 or 4 lessons a month. This offer will last until July 30th, 2024, or until my schedule gets totally booked. Use the link in the description below. Don't forget to use the code KFG online to get that 15% discount on the subscription of your choice as soon as possible. And I will see you online. Peter Lorge, welcome to the Kung Fu Genius podcast. It's so great to have you on.
Oh, it's great to be here. I'm always happy to actually talk to people who are interested.
Awesome. Yeah, well, definitely. This is one of the topics we cover on the podcast. Oddly enough, we cover the gamut from Bruce Lee, Jeet Kune Do, Wing Chun, Kung Fu, movies, all that stuff. But the most controversial topics I ever talk about on my podcast are when I tell people that I think some of the myths about Shaolin Kung Fu and Kung Fu history in general might be a little bit of BS. And that's when people get really upset. I could say I don't think Bruce Lee would have been the best in MMA if he could just suddenly be transported to the future and fight in an MMA fight. That's a lot less controversial than when I tell people that maybe not all Kung Fu came from Shaolin. So it's great to have you here because you're an actual academic. I'm just kind of a nerd who's into this. So it'll be nice for our audience to hear from you. By the way, I first came across your name in the comments of one of my videos. I was talking about history and someone said, hey, you have to read Peter Lorge's book, Chinese Martial Arts. I promptly ordered it. It's one of my favorites. It's full of notes. And I saw my good friend Matthew Pauly's name was on the back there too. So I was like, okay, it's got to be good. The book is fantastic. I recommend it to anyone who has any interest in the history of Chinese martial arts collectively. It's really fantastic. So, and it's also now my go-to gift for people, like my friends for birthdays.
Awesome. Okay.
And yeah, I just gave it to my assistant, Craig Savino, as his birthday gift. He loved it. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. I wanted to get this book basically to find a little bit more about Shaolin history. The book goes obviously a lot deeper than that. And so your academic and publishing credentials are really impressive, but how did you get interested in Chinese studies in general and Chinese martial arts stuff in particular?
So I'm like a nerdy book reading kid from Brooklyn,
Awesome.
27th Street and Kings Highway.
Wow.
And I was always interested, and so I always wanted to do martial arts. As I got older, as a teenager, I wanted to do Sun Tzu Bing Fa, Sun Tzu's Art of War. I wanted to do Chinese. Actually, I wanted to do Japanese. I was going to high school in the 80s when Japan was important. So I started in martial arts at Lou Neglia's
Oh, wow.
martial arts school on Avenue U.
Okay. Yeah. That's like a bedrock of martial arts in New York. Lou
Yeah,
Neglia.
yeah. So I was there. I did that from when I started when I was like 15 over there, and it was exactly what I was looking for.
Awesome.
Very tough, if you will, for someone who was, whatever, 15 years old and reading books and needed, you know, trying to be a man sort of thing and afraid of being in a fight. And then you went in and you got beaten up in class, so that you could go out and not be afraid to get out and fight somewhere
Sure.
else. And he was doing mixed martial arts before, and before that was a thing. But even then, I kind of knew that the ground fighting part of my world was missing, but
Right.
I love that stuff. And I still actually, the way he trained was so intense that I still probably know all of the fundamental techniques that I learned there. I
Wow.
mean, I just like I could do them automatically, grab punch, that stuff is absolutely drilled in. And so that's how I started. And then I went to college. I went to, so I was practicing that. I went to Stuyvesant High School uh, back in the old school building, which was a horrible thing. And so then I went to college and in Texas, and I did Taekwondo and Kendo and Shuaijiao Gong Fu. And my Taekwondo teacher, which we didn't realize at the time, was teaching us all this Hapkido. And I think I'm missing some things. And so I did that. And then I became a Chinese major there because I was, I got closed out of the Japanese class because this was the 80s. So I wanted to take Japanese, couldn't get into the class. So my plan back then was do Japanese, do Chinese, then do classical Chinese so that I could read Sun Art of War. And in Japanese, I wanted to read Miyamoto Musashi's Gorin no Sho, Book of Five Rings. Got stopped, couldn't do the Japanese, so I took Chinese. I eventually got back to the Japanese and took classical Chinese. And then my senior thesis was a translation of Sun Art of War.
Wow.
And then a theory I had while reading it at that time about how Sun was understood, it took me until a couple of years ago, the last book I put out on Swinza and what's it called? Swinza in the West, on how Swinza's Art of War has been interpreted in the West. And that book is, hang on, I think I've got that one. So that book came out. I don't know if it gets the whole thing in my camera, but this came out a couple of years ago. So that was in that sense I've never really advanced because what I want to do as a high school student is basically what I've done as a researcher because I spent my career writing the books I wanted to read, and since no one had written them, I had to write them. So I wish there were this book on the history of Chinese martial arts. I wish there was this explanation of Swin's Art of War. I wish there was a book on gunpowder and guns. I wish there was all this. So that's what I do. And on one level, it feels satisfying. On another level, it feels like I haven't gone anywhere because, the end of the day, you've accomplished figuring out where you started from. So then I went to Taiwan while I was an undergraduate to do Chinese. And then I got out and I actually went to England and did a master's thesis on European medieval military history on the decline of the longbow.
Oh, wow.
I was trying to figure out whether gunpowder weapons, the reason why longbows went out of use, and actually concluded that wasn't really what happened. It was social and economic factors. And then what did I do then? Then I was back, and then I was at Columbia for a little bit. While I was at Columbia, I was studying with Jack Schamberger, who does Chinese Hawaiian Kempo in Manhattan. And then I went to UPenn and did my PhD on Sung Dynasty. That's China from the 10th to the 13th centuries, although my work in this case was just the 10th and 11th century military history. And then I went with my wife. She had a fellowship to go to China to do her research for a year. So we were in Beijing, but then we were going around the Chinese countryside, looking at old buildings. And then we were in Taiwan for 2 years at the Academia Sinica. And then we came back and she got a job down here in Nashville. And then to keep her, they gave me a job.
Oh, wow.
So I published a book on gunpowder and guns in Asian history, in addition to all of these other things. So yeah, it's a very fulfilling thing. I'm very lucky to be able to have a job working on the things that I like to
Right.
work on, and Vanderbilt's very nice in that I get to do classes on a lot of interesting things. I do a class on the global history of tea.
Wow.
I'm doing a class on the history of food in China in the fall, and I've done, Western warfare. I've done love war. Actually, last year at Vanderbilt, and hopefully that book, the book of the conference, I'm about to try to find a publisher for. So yeah, so I ended up, and now I'm looping back around, and I'm trying to do another book on Chinese martial arts, on the origin of internal martial arts.
Oh, wow.
And well, originally I was originally going to do a second book on martial arts, which was going to be on the modern invention of the category of traditional martial arts across East Asia, which would be all about how China, Japan, Korea tried to figure out what to do with martial arts as they modernized and westernized. But then I realized that there was this huge topic looming over it or under it, which was internal martial arts. And I had to do that first. So I've been doing that for a while. And there's a wonderful conference, Martial Arts Studies. There's a martial arts studies, I'm trying to remember, it's a society, or they have a Twitter feed or and some other stuff. And they have a conference every year, and just fabulous people. But it's this really interesting group of people from all these different academic disciplines and some non-academics who come together to talk about, the practice of martial arts. We have people who are physical, who do phys ed, who are teaching it in the sense of trying to figure out what does martial arts do to students. We have people like me I'm actually I'm a minority in that I'm an actual historian. You have anthropologists and cultural studies people and film studies people, and everyone gets together, and it's the only conference I've ever gone to where I think almost everyone is a martial artist.
Wow.
Whereas if you go to an Asian studies conference, you really, like, being a martial artist is what I imagined it used to be like for people who were gay. You didn't want to come out
Sure,
and
sure.
tell anyone. And like you would never want to admit to someone at an Asian studies conference that you practiced martial arts, because there were all these people who would get all that was that was some bad thing. And so you go to this martial arts studies conference and everybody's a martial artist.
Wow.
And we were at the pub after one of them, and someone started showing a technique, and everybody stopped talking and looked. And it's a great group, and I wasn't able to go this year. I'm very sad about that. But so that's been, I'm sort of looping around and trying to fill in a lot of this background, and this internal martial arts thing is a very interesting as a historical problem and for a lot of martial artists. And I presume when I come out with it in a few years, various people will be extremely upset. But I
That's
always
when
say,
you know
don't
you're
worry.
doing something right.
Well, I mean, let's just say, if you do things right, some people will be upset. But just because people were upset doesn't necessarily mean something
Sure.
right.
Right,
But
right, right.
someone said to me, "Aren't you upset that the Taiji people will get really angry at you?" I said, "Yeah, but they attack really slowly." So,
Hey, yeah, I don't know if you've ever saw. There's a very funny video on YouTube. It's like the Tai Chi tournament, and like they're fighting each other, and they're fighting really, really slow, and then the guy will eventually tap the guy, and his arm will break. It's very funny. Actually, that brings me to a great topic. I originally had written to get to it a little bit later in the conversation, but since you brought it up, one of the fascinating aspects of this book here is you talked about that dichotomy between internal and external, which is something that, on the message boards and the forums, this is like where people kind of go at it. And you wrote something in there that I had never seen or read about in any other book or even heard about from anyone else. And that was this idea that, internal martial arts are more refined. They're perhaps a little bit more advanced because they are indigenous to China. It is from China, whereas the external arts, i.e. Shaolin, Buddhist, those kind of arts are foreign, and that not to kind of use this somewhat overused word, but there's a little element of racism in this dichotomy between internal and external. I was wondering if you could discuss that a little bit because I found that fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you where I am now on that issue. That may evolve a bit. So there's this, if you were, and we're fortunate now, I should say, that the kind of digital resources I have for checking texts is so much greater than it was 20 years ago, even 15 years ago. So I went and did a digital search of, a couple of thousand Chinese texts on Chuan, on internal boxing. And you basically don't get much because it didn't exist as a topic, as a thing. What you have is, so there's, in the 1920s, there's a formulation, and guy's name escapes me. He's a very famous guy. He creates, and I actually, it's really sad that I can't remember him. It's actually, I gave a paper on this last year at the Martial Arts Studies Conference before. Age is catching up to me. But basically, you have a guy in the 1920s who is trying to get a job with the Kuomintang army as a martial arts trainer, as a hand-to-hand combat trainer. So in order to raise his profiling, improve his reputation, and maybe sell some books, he publishes a series of books. In fact, they're some of the first books, if not the first books in China that use photographs of martial arts stances.
Wow.
In which he takes all the things he does, puts them all together, and calls them internal martial arts. And because he did Taiji and Xingyi and Bagua, these become internal martial arts.
Wow.
So he puts this all together. Now he's successful. He gets a job so it works for him. So, and at the same time, the Kuomintang was trying to gain control over all sorts of aspects of Chinese culture, one of which was physical culture. And so they start creating this guoshu, this national arts, national martial arts. And they're influenced by this, and they actually get all these martial artists, and they sort of try to put them together and try to come up with some kind of what's Chinese martial arts? What's this physical practice? And one of the things they do, which is kind of interesting in all of this, is they split them up into internal and external because they've got that category in mind. And in fact, I strongly suspect that it's partly this guy's categories and he was possibly involved, and suddenly you now have this category. So they take all these guys from all these different martial arts and they say, look, you guys all have to be genealogically related. Your practice must be. So if you claim to be doing the same martial art, whatever that name is, figure out who's where in this lineage. Of course, this doesn't go very well because all these guys are, first of all, so there's the fact that there's poor record keeping, then there's personalities, then there's money. And we see this in all martial arts today, right? You see some school and some teacher comes in and they develop a bunch of students, and those students want to have their own schools. And okay, so do you join the larger national, international organizations? If you do, well, now you're in a subordinate to another hierarchy. Well, I don't want to be at the bottom of the hierarchy. I want to be at the top of the hierarchy. Well, what happens when you get frustrated at some point? Well, you decide I'm going to make my own hierarchy. And if your school has gotten big enough, now you have all your students. And, I was recently in this thing because my jujitsu school, it expanded, and then various people went and did various things. And then you're sort of, where are you in the school's fragmented, and which one are you at? And then there's personalities, and people have all kinds of issues. And I'm just sort of like, I'm just here to train, but you can't because you've been around long enough that so you try to say that you're not involved, you're happy with everyone and be nice. So what happens is they try to get all these guys together and to create a curriculum, because the next thing they want to do is teach people martial arts, and they want to fit all of these different practices, a lot of which are a mess, into some kind of category, into a curriculum, so that you can have a syllabus, so that you can give people qualifications. So, for example, now if you want to be a gym teacher in China or Taiwan or Korea or the places, you get a qualification in some martial art because they can teach that in school. Okay, well, if you're going to be qualified, what do you have to do? So they try to fit all these things into some clean lines so they can institutionalize it and control it. And one of the things China has done very badly is spread that around the world. Whereas the Koreans have done that really well. Japan did it fairly well. I mean, and so now then we move into this next realm of categories like Olympic competition, things like that. Well, judo got in and taekwondo got in, but so there's all of those affiliations in there, and you're trying to create that. And so internal martial art kind of comes out of this 1920s and after tradition. But at one point, someone realizes, and this is a much longer story than we have time for here, that the only mention of internal martial arts before the 20s, at least that I've found so far, subject to change, is in the 17th century. There is a father and son, Huang Zongxi and Huang Baijia, and the father writes an account. This is right at the fall of the Ming Dynasty, the beginning of the Qing Dynasty. And this is where that political and racial component comes in. And there is this account of this martial artist, Wang Zhongnan, who teaches Huang Baishi, the son, martial arts. And after he dies, the father writes an account of him and the son writes an account. That's the first and only time I've thus far found before the 20s at all, where you have this mention of this guy doing internal martial arts. And they say here he was this great martial artist in the Ming. The dynasty falls. He becomes this sort of, if you will, sort of a hidden master. He was awesome as a martial artist, but so he trains the son in martial arts until the son decides. So the father, because he had served the Ming dynasty, he won't serve the new dynasty. And that's a whole cultural thing. But the son takes the civil service exam, serves the new dynasty. So that's a separation there. And he stops doing martial arts after he decides to basically start studying. So what happens is in the 20s or maybe a little after, somebody remembers about this account. Now, Randy Brown, who teaches Mantis Kung Fu and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu near Boston, first raised this with me. He found out he was doing Mantis, and because he does Jiu-Jitsu as well, he began to see that in Mantis Kung Fu, there are all these setups. You sort of have these grabs, collar tie, that looked like to him like wrestling, like grappling. And so he kind of raised this with me, and I went back and I read the original account of what this Wang Zhongnan guy was supposed to have done. So there is a translation of this by, I think Doug Wiles did a translation of it. And the story is this guy Wang Zhongnan this bunch of soldiers tries to grab him. I can't remember why. And it says, so the translation says, he beats them all. Basically, he knocks them all down. It's not actually what it says. What it says is he throws them all. So what Randy had raised for me and what was important, it jarred my thinking, and I looked at the language more carefully, is that a lot of his conception of what was internal was actually very much more like wrestling, grappling. And so that what we have is not so much a question of what we understand as internal, but as what they were talking about was, not that he was this guy who, he was doing chi exercises, but some guy who he threw people, or he, and if you when you go, I was a stand-up striker for like 30 years before I went over fully to jujitsu, and now I'm starting to go back towards striking again. And if you watch, grappling is not a good spectator sport. Unless you really know it, and even then, it's
Right.
because everything is, and
It's
why
very
isn't,
subtle. Yeah.
yeah, it's very subtle. Why isn't that, to get back to that question of, you know, why isn't that working? Well, you can't see the accommodation that the guy is making. It looks like he's under a lot of pressure, but actually he's relaxed into it, and you're saying, what's going on here? This is really, you can't see it. Whereas striking, even real striking, as opposed to movie stuff or the big stuff, is much more cinematic, is much more obvious. So what do these terms neja and waija mean? So that becomes this connection. And the other thing that Wang Zhongnan gets connected to, uh, ultimately, well, he creates this thing, and you get this other connection to Zhang San Feng. So Zhang San Feng is, and here we get, and this is, I apologize to everyone. This is very complicated, and I am in the process of sorting out if you, I think it's a little bit back to Einstein's comment of, you think your problems with math are bad, mine I can assure you mine are worse. So this guy Zhang Sanfeng then gets associated with this internal stuff, and what they say is, so Zhang Sanfeng was this Taoist immortal. So if they say someone's an immortal, that's probably your first clue that this is a myth, unless you believe in that, in which
Right.
case that's fine. And they say that Zhang Sanfeng was this Taoist immortal, and he was summoned to the court of Sung Huizong. Huizong was a Sung emperor at the beginning, first 20 years of the 12th century. And it says he tried to, he was summoned to court. As he was trying to go to court, he had been trained in uh, Shaolin martial arts, which is also a clue. Anyone saying that that happened before the Ming, obviously it's made up. And the road was blocked by bandits. He had a dream at night from the Xuanwu, the dark warrior, who taught him this martial art. It reverse engineered the external martial art. And then the next day he beat up like 100 bandits and made it to court. All right, so you're like, okay, look, I'm a Sung historian. I'm like, okay, he does not show up in Sung records. There's nothing. That doesn't mean anything completely. I mean, if he shows up, awesome. If he doesn't show up, the records are incomplete. Okay, fine. Well, there was a guy, Zhang Sanfeng, and he was a Taoist, but he was at the end of the end of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol period, beginning of the Ming dynasty, so 14th century. Here's where it gets even more fun. So, Zhang Sanfeng is he is at Mount Wudang, and he is a Neja practitioner, internal medicine, or Neidan or Neja. Okay, you're still with me. So,
Yes.
so now we have this guy who was a Neja guy at Wudang, which is a Taoist place, which is affiliated with the Dark Warrior Xuanwu. But in the 14th century, not the 12th century. And you're saying, but if he's immortal, obviously he could have been around all that. So I'll leave you with that. Anyway, so the first Ming emperor actually tries to summon Zhang Sanfeng to court repeatedly, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and some of his successors also try to bring him. They never find him. All right. Later, people doing Taiji will decide that their art comes from Zhang Sanfeng and is connected to Wudang. And that's because Wudang is Taoist, and then you have Shaolin, which is Buddhist. And you're saying, okay, so now we're clear. We've taken sides, and we've disparaged the Buddhists as being external and foreign and all of that. Taoism being internal and Chinese and all that. That's well established. Okay, so let's take another step back. So before all of this happened, all of this Neidan stuff developed out of thunder magic, Taoist thunder magic, which then transformed during the Sung Dynasty, late Sung and Southern Sung, into Neidan, internal practice, internal cultivation. And then it gets very religious and it gets very complicated. Anyway, so we have all of these things happening. But they are all separate. In the 20th century, they get tied together into a coherent narrative, which they were not. And so what happens, and right now I actually had a conversation with someone recently who she really helped me out, a literature person. What's her name? Kang Ni. Was it Zhang Kang Ni, Wang Kang Ni? And she was pointing out, because there's this weird thing about what's going on in the 17th century, that this guy who writes an account of this Wang Zhengnan, this martial artist, and being this great Taoist, the guy who writes that account is a massively famous Confucian. So what the hell is going on? I haven't figured that out yet. But apparently, at that time, there's this very complicated cultural things are going on, which I have to sort out. And the other thing to keep in mind for the people who really want to find Shaolin martial arts or Wu-Tang martial arts in earlier China, if you read the Romance of the Three Kingdoms or you read The Outlaws of the Marsh, so if you read Sanguo Yanyi or Shui Hu Zhuan, you will not find that. You will not find Shaolin. You will not find Wudang. And these are novels that are set in an earlier time, but they are compiled into a novel form in the Ming Dynasty. So you don't have this construction. There are Buddhist monks who are martial artists in the Outlaws of the Marsh,
Right.
but they're not connected to Shaolin. And of course, they're not exactly great Buddhists. Sheng Lu, Sagacious Lu, is this guy with all these tattoos who's drinking and beating people up. And he's essentially a bandit so you have all these, so a lot of these categories then become not just firmed up in the 20th century, they become instantiated and reinstantiated by the movies. And if you read some of the Hong Kong movie guys talking about, they're like, oh, we made all that stuff up.
Yes.
And then you find out that if you look at the tradition of the stuntmen, a lot of the stuntmen come out of the Hongga tradition. So one of the reasons why Hongga becomes so important is because all the stuntmen learned Hongga, because that's where they came out of.
Right.
And people like Jackie Chan, of course, came out of the Peking opera tradition. So he's a Jingju guy. And all of that. So all of these traditions, which was why my original book was going to be more about that. But before I can get to that, I have to sort out all this internal stuff and make it clear how, and the fact that there are huge gaps. So this is the point where people outside the field even inside the field, make the obvious point. Well, but there's these centuries where you don't know because there's nothing. So it could be. It's like, well, yes, it could be.
Right.
But I can't prove something I have no data for. And to assert that somehow this existed for all this time without any notification. I mean, it's possible, right? All kinds of things are possible. The records are the records. But nowadays you can search not just the main histories, you can search the local histories. This stuff doesn't show up in the local histories. Whereas if I talk to you about something like a topic like gunpowder, I can tell you exactly in the Ming and the Qing dynasties where they were making saltpeter, where they were getting salt, where all of these things, I can get very detailed about that. Now, martial arts is not that written about. So I don't have the documents, but people got, in response to that, my first book on martial arts, people got really angry. and so it was a very split reaction. So there was, and of course I should say too, that usually as an academic, you write a book, you finish the manuscript, you submit the manuscript, you get comments, you fix it, you send it in, you finally send everything in. By the time you've sent everything in and gotten all the details done, you might have finished writing it 6 months before. You might have finished the research 3, 4, 5 years before. The book, you hand it in, the book comes out physically a year later, and then academic book reviews come out 3 years after that. The martial arts book came out. There were people ranting on Amazon almost immediately, which is a shock as an academic. And the split was between this, insert bad word, doesn't think that Shaolin is the source of martial arts, to wow, finally actual history.
Right.
And so the important thing for all these people, and I appreciate the people who were just like, where are the techniques? I want the techniques. It's like, it's not just about techniques. We don't have techniques. So, but this notion, I don't know what, if you go to other countries and you try to study martial arts, when I was in Taiwan, I was actually practicing Taekwondo because I couldn't find a physical school, like a place where I could go, okay, hi, I want to sign up for classes. Here's my monthly money so I
Right.
can practice. I couldn't, the only thing I could find was Taekwondo. And that's one of the brilliant things about the Koreans is that they have this nice curriculum. They set up that way. Found a place while I was doing my dissertation research, practice there. And they're like, well, if you want to do Chinese martial arts, you got to go to the park and find these guys. And then it's kind of, and I'm an academic. I'm a very antisocial person. So I don't want to hang around, like I don't, so that never worked for me. But everybody has this idea, they've been watching the movies and they see Jet Li training 50, 60, 100 guys on a beach doing martial arts. That didn't exist. So the schools of martial arts were tiny. This was true in Japan as well and Korea before these modern martial arts, which were mass produced. If you read that wonderful book on Wing Chun, God, where is it? It's like up on my shelf over there. It and talks about how, Ip Man goes to Hong Kong and he's teaching these,
Restaurant union, yeah.
restaurant union workers in like the hall above this is not it's more like the YMCA, which of course the Jingwumen was in competition with the
Right.
YMCA in China, because most people, as martial artists know, don't practice martial arts, aren't interested. Some people are interested until they actually practice, and then they decide no. And so it's not like there were these lineages running over centuries that have any real value. So then you're kind of in the situation of, I mean, when I do this internal book, the plan is to sort out this early history part and then to do a chapter on this. There's a wonderful book on, was it Dao Jiao Yu, Ne Jia Chuan or something like that on in Taoism and internal martial arts. A wonderful Chinese book, and do Bagua, Taiji, and Xingyi, the early bits. I'm going to stop like in the late 19th century or something like that before I stop everybody. But they have the lineages, and where we actually start having historical records. And then the problem is everyone assumes that all of the old martial artists were these awesome, you know, wuxia kind of flying around the room thing.
Badasses, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Or that they were all purely doing one martial art, which is another interesting aspect that people boggles some people's minds, that most really I have some wonderful Chinese books, biographies of famous Chinese martial artists, and you have these encyclopedias. And what you'll see is very few guys practiced one martial art.
Wow.
Serious martial artists, they went and they studied with this guy and that guy, and they studied different martial arts. So then, but they must be masters in everything. Well, they're not masters in everything. Or what do they teach their students? Well, who teaches a pure, whatever the curriculum is? I mean, because you do Wing Chun, right?
Yes.
And so there's variations in that. And then
Yes.
we have huge arguments about that, and that get pretty heated. I think that's a mild way of putting it. And why should that be the case? Well, in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and in mixed martial arts, you don't actually have those kinds of arguments because they are very deliberately and self-consciously not traditional
Right.
in the sense that so Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has changed in the what about 14 years I've been doing it. A lot of the techniques, some techniques have just changed completely. Emphasis has changed, new techniques come in.
Leg
Holy
locks is huge now.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
leg lock. And I learned, and then I had to then all the leg lock thing came in, then I had to, like a bunch of other people, be in remedial leg locking for the last, few years. And I still feel like I'm behind the curve on that. I mean, I'll hit leg locks sort of pretty regularly now, but it's still it's taken me a long, long time. And so yeah, and the game still changes because we have these guys and they're doing and also having competition is really useful because there are these guys pushing the envelope on techniques. And you get things where people are like, oh, you don't have to do that. Wait, what? I don't have to do that anymore? No, no, you just do this. Oh, okay. Well, that changed everything. So, even my teachers have gone back and be, okay, you have to change that. So, and the internet has massively revolutionized it because you say, oh, I got to do this. And you can get online and watch five different people doing something and pick up all kinds of wonderful techniques. And so it's really fabulous, as opposed to an art that's saying, no, we are a traditional art. There is the correct way to do it. Master Oogway deciphered, and it really is that. And
Sure.
and the idea is that there is this point of origin of martial arts, and which is perfect and invincible. And the further you get away from it, and the further you diverge from that, the weaker it is, and the less authentic it is.
Yes.
And so and there's this like notion that you're going to get back to this origin point, and when I say people like that doesn't exist, that for people is incomprehensible. And that's one of many reasons I started going over toward issues of talking about food, is because people don't get quite as upset about food. So, if you say to someone like, look, before the Westerners showed up in China, there were no chili peppers in Sichuan. And oh, yeah, I mean, I guess that's a New World crop. And so, Sichuan, food in Sichuan in the 12th century didn't have chili peppers.
Wow.
Yeah, I know people, before the 16th, 17th, that it comes in much later. There's actually a wonderful book on the history of eating spicy in China that I just became aware of. I have it on my computer now. I got to read it. But it's sort of these chilies get to southern China and then they work their way up the Yangtze and end up in Sichuan and
Wow.
they stay in Sichuan and Hunan, but in Guangdong and stuff, they sort of, yeah, don't go for that.
Right.
But it's inconceivable for a lot of people in Sichuan, let's say, that what was your food like before you had chili peppers? Well, in martial arts is very similar in the sense that there were always martial artists, but there were always guys doing trained violence. But and there are always guys who are good at it, who are just naturally good at it. And I'm not naturally good at it, but I'm really interested. So I have I'm very fortunate having a long line of very good teachers. So and I don't have to invent anything. I just got to try to do what they tell me to do. And that makes me a better fighter than I would have been. It doesn't make me invincible, but okay, I'm better than I would have been.
Sure.
But there isn't but when I see my teachers and I realize that here are these guys who are really physically talented, and then there's all the hard work and all that stuff. They're good at it and they practice that and they learned it from some other guy. And the art changes and the style of how you use these techniques changes. And I was saying to someone we were doing some technique the other day and I was like, I don't use this. I've hit this technique maybe twice in 14 years, but I need to know it. I need to refresh myself on it, both to defend it, but also maybe it helps me. Maybe if I come at it again, it'll start working for me, but also I have to teach it because maybe somebody I teach it to, they go, oh, this really works for me. So I have to know the practice as a whole rather than if I was just a fighter, I just have to be
Sure.
good.
Right.
I just have to win the fight. I don't have to be good at the art. And so there's all these conflicts in this that are pedagogical and traditional. And so I keep thinking at some point that it would be interesting to start talking to people like the Gracies and maybe Danaher and some of these guys. I mean, I don't know any of these guys, but at some point say to them, look, it seems to me as you guys have tried to create curriculums and tried to not just that's the curriculums as opposed to simply just where they're putting out videos, and more power to them. They're doing these like, here's a systematic way to do this. But once you get to that point, are you creating a traditional martial art? Are you, because you're fixing everything and saying, here's the correct way to do this? And so, yeah, you'll be good if you do that, but does your mind close down
Right.
and
Right.
stop thinking about, you get in certain positions and you're like, well, and I should say, and I've done a bunch of stupid things in this. I was in this one position for about a year and a half where I kept thinking there had to be a way out. So I was letting guys, I was on the ground and grabbing my knees, and I was like, there's got to be a way through this. I spent a year and a half trying to figure out the solution to it. Losing, 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 losing. One of my coaches said to me at one point, he was rolling, and he said, what the hell are you doing? Why are you letting me get both grips? He's like, you take one off. And I was like, I'm just thinking there's got to be that the training is wrong, right? That something the orthodoxy must be wrong. I keep thinking there's got to be a way through this. And he looked at me and said, "You arrogant bastard." You know,
Hey everyone, just want to let you know Wing Chun Illustrated is now offering a paperback edition through Amazon, reaching a larger global market. And no, they're not ditching the glossy magazine edition through MagCloud. You can now simply choose the version of this magazine you prefer and the one with the cheapest shipping wherever you live. Order your copy of Wing Chun Illustrated today across 12 Amazon marketplaces with free shipping for Prime members. Go and check that out.
and so at that point, I gave up the experiment. Someone tries to grab it, I take one of the grips off so that I don't have to deal with that. But in the back of my mind, there's still something saying, man, there's got to be something. And if you basically get to the point where you're like, okay, this is orthodoxy, I'm not trying to do anything else. On the one hand, it makes it much more efficient because you don't waste time on this. But on the other hand, maybe there is some solution. And and so when you start creating this curriculum, which is wonderful for teaching, and it's wonderful for business, right?
Yeah.
Because a student comes in and I got to know this. You do Taekwondo, you're like, I got to know this form, this form, this form. I got this. I train. I do this board break. I'm good. I do a little sparring. And depending on what school, and I can run a mile in this amount. So you have a fitness goal and you have a curriculum. You satisfy that. That's great. It's very understandable. It's clear. Jiu-jitsu is murderous on your mentality because you you don't do that, and you essentially start in the middle of things because there's no starting point, and you sit there going, I don't, you have white belts, and my wife and my older daughter just started to do jiu-jitsu a few weeks ago. There was a women's only class, wonderful stuff. And my friend Shannon teaches great class, and they're learning it, and they're just like, this is really cool. But what happens when I do this or what? It's like, well, there's a whole set of moves, and you just go right into it because they're like, okay, here's your move for today, and here's a couple of
Right.
moves. And now we're going to do some free, we're going to roll, and you roll, and you don't know what the hell you're doing, and you get in all these positions, and you're rolling, particularly when you're rolling with other lower belts, and they don't know what they're doing, and you're like, well, what do you do here? What do you do there? And it's mentally taxing because you're, you know, you literally come into it, and the first thing you realize is that, wow, do you know nothing?
Right.
And then even worse thing is then you roll with some higher belt who just obliterates you because you don't even know what's going on.
Right.
I remember some years ago I was rolling with some white belt or something. He just started and he did something while we were in position. I just hopped over him to the other side because I was shifting, And he was like, where'd you go? Because his attention was like this guy here, and I just went to his back, and it was like magic. It wasn't, it was just I knew to move there, and you didn't even conceive of it
Right.
that someone could move that way. Whereas it's obvious once you've learned it, and then it looks like magic, like there's a person in front of you, and you're fighting for your life, and the next thing you know, they've disappeared and they're behind you.
Right. Right.
And and so, I mean, it's one of the reasons why jujitsu has this wonderful openness to it, but it's in a certain sense much more mentally taxing.
Right.
I want to say, psychologically taxing, because and then you go through these periods where you lose and you're losing. Whereas, in a nice formal structured martial art, okay, I did this thing right, I did those exercises
Yeah.
right.
Some steady
Yeah, yeah.
upward
Yeah, yeah.
progress. Yeah.
And then I did a little bit of sparring and it didn't work out the way I wanted. Jiu-jitsu is like, okay, a couple of moves and now we're going to roll for half an hour.
Right.
And you come out of it and you're like, man, that just really sucked. I got beaten by lower belts. I don't mind being beaten by a higher belt. And you're just like, what the heck just happened? And so there's this clash between the traditional art that's more fixed, that's a clear path, and then all the international structures that go with it and all that stuff. And
Right.
then these open martial arts. But in reality, most martial arts for history was, if you will, the open thing. And there was some guy who was a good fighter. And did he have a complete art? Probably not. He had a couple of effective moves. He had a good self-defense thing. Or what I argue in that book is most of martial arts from most of Chinese history was about being in the military.
Right.
It
The
wasn't
military
about,
arts.
like,
Yeah.
we have this idea that yeah, and so you have your kid, you put them in Taekwondo, and it's wonderful because they go and they get this traditional culture, and they're like, yes, sir, and no, sir, and they bow and they get some exercise and they learn to defend themselves a little bit, and they come back learning to be respectful. And it's that weird Asian, and here we have this kind of Orientalist notion that these traditional societies where the kids learn to be polite and they do all this stuff, and that's great. And so you put them in there, and isn't that wonderful? And they can advance, and you take them and the place is clean and they don't get too beaten up,
Right.
and that's great. And then you look and you say, that's not like the army where they're like, okay, you know, how to kill some other guy, and and the actual fighting in the army, is very simple. They're
Right.
not learning all this, and we always joke that, it's kind of the Hadra Gracie who's got these like very simple fundamental techniques that are perfected. And this guy is like, he's going to beat you with this technique that, the technique. It doesn't matter. He's better at it. He's not doing fancy stuff. It's simple, but what is this? He said, it's simple, but it's not easy.
Right.
And but you want to do like the flowery thing, or you want to like, what happens if you get in this situation? And the guys who are really good, they can get the simplest techniques to work in the most complicated situations. And you're like, how do you get out of that? That technique shouldn't have gotten you out of that. Well, it does for this guy. My teacher Sean Hammonds will Granby out of all kinds of positions, and you're like, that's not supposed to work. He can do it. And so when you look at that historically, what you're talking about is a bunch of guys who are good at fighting. And if you're in the army, what happens? They say, okay, here's a spear, stab, 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 maybe a couple of things with a spear. None of this like spinning and
Sure.
stand in a group of guys. Stand there, don't run. Sword. Was that movie with was it Hidden Kingdom with Jet Li and Jackie Chan, where they're trying to teach the kid, I
Oh,
haven't
for
learned
Forbidden Kingdom or something.
Forbidden Kingdom. Yeah, yeah. And it's like, yeah, here's a strike, here's a block,
Right.
and what more do you want? At what point do you become invincible?
Sure. Sure.
And so for most of Chinese history, most people, martial arts were about learning to fight in the military in a very specific context. Weapons were generally controlled by the government. They didn't like people having too many weapons around because you might have an insurgency, you might have a rebellion.
Sure.
So if you start learning to fight, why are you learning to fight? If you're not doing it within the military context, what's your intention? That you look like a troublemaker. You look like someone who's going to resist the government's authority. So there's this limitation and there's this great suspicion. It's sort of, this strange thing we have in the United States where we have a bunch of people who say like I should be able to openly carry, essentially a military weapon. And you say, oh, and okay, you're going to carry that weapon. Don't you think people will be concerned
Right.
that you're, and they're like, well, why would you be concerned? Like, well, because you're carrying a weapon. Whereas, if you came out with a battle axe and walked down the street, people, oh my God, the guy's got a battle axe.
Yes.
Or sort of like wouldn't justifiably like, why would you have that?
Right.
And so, but that's a sort of cultural ideological framework, but that's also martial arts, I would argue, which is, and what I find so weird about the the cult of guns, and I taught a class on the gun in history, and I stopped teaching it because
Another hot button topic.
well, yeah, the last part of the class, the last quarter of the class was the gun in America, and there's some very good books on it, and the students were fabulous, I should say. It was I try to read at least one new book per course every time I teach it, so that I don't get stale, to go back to your continual training. And I found that reading the books was the most upsetting part. But you have people who are essentially, it's buying weapons and not training with them. And I shot pistol. I was on the Oxford pistol team for a year when I was doing my master's. And, we trained a couple of times a week. And I think I was at Gatwick Airport, and they had recently started having armed police there. And so I was in England, and so I was doing that. We were shooting, like I said, twice a week, and I was coaching I guess it was the Taekwondo club at Oxford while I was there too. And I started talking. I had a plane delay, so I started talking to the security guards. Like, well, how often do you guys shoot? Oh, we shoot once a month. I think it was once a month, once every other month, something like that. Well, we do martial arts. Oh, really? How often do you train? Oh, like once a month. So it's kind of like, I'm like a graduate student. I'm like, shooting twice a week, and I'm, training a couple of times a week, and and you're sort of going, wow, that's not reassuring.
Right.
And so, but whereas if you are, we're being martial artists, we admire, we aspire to be people who train and have discipline and attempt to perfect an art and get better at it. And, we would happily train with learning to use a sword or a staff or any weapon because it's cool.
Sure.
So it's use or something like this. Why do you train with a sword? Because it's cool, It's like,
What other reason is there?
whatever. I'm not gonna. I don't know. It doesn't have a practical. I'm not. And we're not. I haven't. When I was growing up in Brooklyn, I was in Lou Neglia's full contact kickboxing, street fighting, self defense. That was what I was interested in at that time. I wanted that. I'm a middle-aged college professor, with I don't train for self defense. I train because I enjoy it and all these other things. It's good for my health and think, well, except for the injuries, but in general, it's a great thing. I'm not training for self-defense. And if someone says I could beat you up, definitely you could beat me up. I'm not there to fight anybody.
Right.
And when you're young, maybe or some people in certain circumstances, it makes sense to have that. And we actually have. I was just talking with my coach this morning and saying how we got a whole bunch of former Navy SEALs that we train with, and all that stuff. And so you have all these people. That's a different skill set, and we've got these, like I said, we got these former Navy SEALs, and they're high-ranking guys, and I roll with them, and they're really good, and they're legit, serious BJJ guys. That doesn't make them superhuman. They, if you want someone to jump out of a plane, land in a Zodiac, sneak in someplace and shoot some people, I'm sure they're really good at that.
Right.
We're really good at that. That's a completely different set of martial arts skills and like I said, legit skills, and we all wish we had them, than anything else. And it's a, and so that's what was going on in the past. That was the repository of most martial skills. And these guys at Shaolin, most of the guys who were at Shaolin who had martial arts skills were either security forces, because it's a large institution that has lands that and buildings that need to be protected, or they're a bunch of bandits, basically. There was this floating population. We talk about the rivers and lakes, the Jianghu, which shows up. And are these guys good? I mean, when we say bandits, there's roving, wandering guys who are maybe not the best people. It's in a sedentary society that's primarily agricultural. The scary people are people who wander around. That's a weird bunch of people. Floating populations of people who are on the rivers. There are boatmen. These are a little bit suspect. Merchants, if you think about it in any culture, merchants are really, they're tough guys. They're not like our ideas, like merchants are these, wealthy, annoying guys, right? And in pre-modern cultures, some guy who wandered around the countryside with valuables to trade with other people, leaving their home to wander on a road where you could be attacked at any time. These were tough guys. And they tended to be armed. And so now you got this wandering bunch of guys who are armed, who have goods to trade. Where did they get them? What's the distinction between a pirate and a merchant ship?
Right.
And so what's martial arts? Well, I have a sword. How good am I with a sword? But I got a sword, and it's and the other thing, I guess, the point I tried to make in the book too was that most martial arts is, because it's about actual fighting, you're going to be armed. You're not going to be unarmed.
Sure.
What's the advantage? I have a sword. You don't. Awesome. I have a knife. That's much better. I have an advantage. But in our modern society, it makes sense to be trained in unarmed combat because we don't go around armed, even in America, for the most part. You are not under constant threat for the most part in America. And that's why you train. So the meaning of the martial arts for someone in 21st century America is very different than it would have been in the past. And in fact, a very wonderful book in Chinese actually criticized me in the introduction for this book for not distinguishing that into the 20th century, the martial arts changed, the relationship. And I didn't make the distinction that while martial arts persists in the military, martial arts as practiced in the civilian population changes in nature. It becomes a different thing.
Sure.
So that's, again, back to the issue that there is a shift.
Right. And,
at some point that nuance fell out. But I really appreciated this guy's, Richard Mack's comment on that. He was dead on. I mean, he was absolutely right. I made that mistake. So. Awesome.
Well, hey, this has been absolutely fascinating. That hour went by very quickly. I feel that, I wasn't sure, the first time you ever talk to someone, this is the first time we've ever discussed anything. You never know if you get like these one-word answers, and then I'm like, I need to make sure I got plenty to talk about. I got to like two things, and you were fantastic. This was really great. I would really love to have you on again sometime. There's a lot of ground to cover there, still with the Shaolin stuff. I love what you said about so much of what we know nowadays is also through the lens of looking at things through films, and how that's kind of solidified a lot of these ideas. I actually wanted to mention something really quickly about that. The late great director Lau Ka-leung, who famously directed 36 Chambers, which is another movie that, created the myth of the Shaolin Temple. Yeah. He admitted once that he actually got a lot of those ideas from watching the David Carradine Kung Fu show. Yeah. And that's where he decided to make all these different training rooms. So like even Asian cinema, even Hong Kong cinema, was influenced by the West on something that's supposed to be Chinese. And now people pretty much believe that there was a Shaolin temple with multiple chambers where people went and trained and learned all these things. So thank you so much for joining us today. This was absolutely fantastic. I hope we can do it again sometime. And I would definitely love to meet you face to face and just listen to you talk. You have so many great things to say. And I look very much forward to your next book. So thanks again. All right, everyone. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of The Kung Fu Genius. As always, don't forget to subscribe to The Kung Fu Genius. Hit that bell for notifications. Let me know in the comments what you liked about this episode. And as always, I'll see you guys next time.
Word is I'm a kung fu genius. Technique speaks for me, not lineage. Forget Jet Li, cause I'm the one. Many call me seafood, but to you I'm sea gung. And I produce masters. You surpassed us. Your kung fu stiffer than corpse and caskets. City Wing Chun is the house I built. Violate the gate and your blood gets spilt. Alex Richter, always the victor.
I think there was a typo in there. Hold on a second. Sorry, Andrew's going to have to do a little bit of work. A little bit of editing work.
Oh, no, don't make him work.
I know.